This is the eLearn podcast, episode number 75.
So I knew that my content was good, but I wasn't sure if my engagement was at the level it should have been at. And I question at this point, if my engagement isn't there, how engaged are my students?
Welcome to the eLearn podcast. My name's Ladek, and I'm your host from OpenLMS. My guest today is Marianna Goral, a digital learning specialist and consultant recognized for the development of a variety of e-learning products. In 2016, Marianna was awarded Best British Educational Research and Scholarly Work in Education by the British Educational Research Association Committee. In this interview, Marianna shared with me her deep and broad experience throughout the life cycle of e-learning under the lens of exploratory practice, an educational movement from the 90s, which for her is more relevant than ever today. In this very encompassing conversation, Marianna and I talk about what exploratory practice is, where it belongs in the broader action research framework, and why it can be so useful for the way we deliver and plan our learning today. We also talk about the role of the educational manager and the art of blending organizational prerogatives with sound pedagogy and high-quality lessons for learners. We also touch on issues of mental health and burnout among educators with Marianna's own story and the importance of persevering through your journey of self-discovery. And then finally, Marianna and I discuss how you can help your learners while creating reliable evidence and how Marianna makes quality of life a priority for everyone in the classroom. But before we get started, quick word from our sponsors.
The eLearning podcast is sponsored by the eLearn Success Series, a uniquely valuable set of events that bring together sector experts and thought leaders to offer solutions to the most critical challenges and issues at the intersection of education and technology. Get your free ticket to all 4 sessions at elearnsuccessseries.com. And OpenLMS, a company that provides world-class LMS solutions that empower organizations to meet education and workplace learning needs. Learn more by visiting openlms.net.
Hello, Marianna. Welcome to the eLearning podcast. How are you today?
Hi, Stephen. Thank you very much for having me. I'm great. Thanks very much for inviting me along.
My pleasure.
How are you?
I'm wonderful. Thank you. Life's always good here in Mexico.
I bet it is.
Where do we find you sitting today?
Well, I'm actually in a much colder part of the world, in the Northern Hemisphere, based in Poland at the moment, coming to you live from Wrocław.
Wow, Poland. I've been to Gdansk. That's where I've been in Poland.
Oh, that's a great place to go. If you're going to come and visit Poland, that's a lovely place to go. Good choice.
Had a good time. I delivered a training there, many moons ago. Fantastic. Marianna, I've already teed you up, in the intro to the podcast with, who you're working with, what you're doing and those kinds of things. And, given the show notes, but I always love to give everyone, the 30 seconds to be able to sort of introduce themselves. So tell us about who you are, what you're doing now, and we'll go from there.
Right. Well, I sort of, so I've been on quite a professional journey in the past couple of years, not precipitated by the pandemic. I'd just like to point that out. That just happened in the interim. But yes, so originally I come from a teaching background, English as a second language. That's where I started. I started training, more corporate training with Berlitz when I was I was 19 when I first started, and continued.
Well, that was like 3 years ago, right? So.
Oh, absolutely, yeah, of course.
Yeah, sure, exactly.
And then I continued, and this was in Poland. So this is initially where I started my teaching journey, and then I continued it on in London. So I moved to London. And there I moved away from corporate training more into English as a second language training, EFL in English language schools. And then from there, I moved on to lecturing and became a lecturer over 10 years ago. So went into higher education, which was quite a journey in itself. Got heavily involved in a 5-year research project that I truly believe has changed my life, not only professionally, but on a personal level as well. That took me to some amazing places, meeting amazing people, doing amazing stuff. And then recently, 2 years ago, I have become a curriculum development manager and managing an educational remit or a suite of professional development products that are and learning events online. So webinars, micro courses, micro credentialing, all that fun stuff.
Fantastic. And today we're going to talk about that journey, but through the lens of exploratory practice. And so I'm really, I'm intrigued by this title of what exploratory practice is. So tee us up. Give us that, like, how did you stumble into exploratory practice? I know you and I, obviously we've talked before the show. And so I've heard this story, but what was the genesis of it? How did you stumble into this? And I just kind of would love to hear that genesis of why did this become so important and how it's really sort of changed your entire career.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, using the word stumble, I think, is just perfectly, you've hit the nail on the head. It definitely did feel like I'd stumbled across it. So I think if I were to go back about 7 years back, when I initially got involved in exploratory practice, I got to a stage of my teaching career. I'd been teaching for about 14 years at that point. Where I felt that I needed something more. I felt that I was going into a bit of a realm of complacency professionally, which also was reflecting somewhat in my on other sort of levels of my life. I think being happy at work is very important. And I got to a stage where I think I got to the bottom of what it was. I felt that and this is something that I've come across in a lot of literature around classroom practice. I started my classroom became the mechanical classroom. And what I mean by this is that my approach to my teaching and to my profession became very mechanical. And I felt that was being reflected in my lessons, in how I was going about my daily lectures. And
can you give me like I'm wondering if others listening right now would resonate with that. Especially, most of our audience are from the higher education universe.
Sure,
so what do you mean by mechanical? Is it, you were teaching the same 3 classes every year. And so you kind of had your lesson plan already put together and here was your slides. And so you kind of just brushed them off at the beginning of the year, or, what does mechanical mean to you?
Well, exactly what you said. Part of it was absolutely the fact that, I had a really good module. There was nothing wrong with it. In fact, the feedback was very good in many respects. It was working fine. It was adhering to all the quality assurance and competency framework. So I was hitting all the marks in that respect. But it was just the day to day. And I think it was a case of I started asking myself, are you truly fully engaged in what you're doing right now? Or is it just in and out? And is really that the way you want to be continuing your professional life? So I had to have a pretty honest conversation with myself. And I think it did come across even more so when I was doing some professional development. So at the time, our university, obviously, like most universities, you have to do your CPD, continuous professional development. And I was going to these events, let's say, these seminars, workshops, and a lot of the time I felt they were quite one-dimensional. They were either talking about, the latest little tech things that were coming up in education, bearing in mind this is quite, a few years back, or it was looking at, we'll try this activity. And I didn't really feel that this was fully addressing what I felt was a very unique, complex ecology of my classroom practice. And so I was walking away from even this continual professional development, and I was thinking, well, yes, I can apply this, and I'm not disregarding professional development. I thought there was a lot of interesting, input there and knowledge, but I just really didn't feel like it was making the difference that I wanted it to make in my classroom, both in terms of for my students and for myself, in terms of really this full engagement. So I knew that my content was good, but I wasn't sure if my engagement was at the level it should have been at. And I question at this point, if my engagement isn't there, how engaged are my students? Are they really buying what I'm selling them? Is this all just a performance? Are we all just in a performance zone? So where is this true learning zone that is happening? Have I lost that as a teacher as well? And, is this fair on my students? So it went into a sort of a deeper pondering. So at that point, what had happened was in our institute at that point, an initiative had come to light. This was as a response to not enough faculty, language faculty engaging in research. So this is a common thing in higher education where a lot of the times, a lot of the faculties, are very research led, but the language faculties tend to fall short here. And there are a lot of, we could go into a deeper conversation as to why that is. But definitely at our university, this was very apparent, and the initiative was to get more teaching, language teaching staff of all languages, more onto a research route, and for the institute to be more research driven, or at least have a balance between being research led but also teaching led. So there was this gap, and I thought to myself, well, I'm going to try this. I wasn't quite sold on the idea. It was recommended by my manager as something that I could sink my teeth in. I was a bit skeptical. I thought, is this just another tick box activity? Is this just going to be another sort of, let's just do this for the sake of doing it? So I was skeptical, and it took me a few months to come around to it. But professionally, it was the best decision I'd ever made. And it was not only game changing on so many levels, professionally, but also most importantly in my classroom for my students, but it also resonated in other areas of my life. So it was a very good, it was a great decision. It was a great decision.
So we've been talking around about, so like define it for me. What is exploratory practice? Like what was maybe that seminal moment when you were like, okay, I'm going to try this, this could be nothing. Like, what is it that you did? Like what does the process look like? Or what is the, like unfold it for me?
Sure. So exploratory practice is a principled framework. There are 7 principles to this framework. And I'm just going to mention 2, which I think are most important, the ones that I focused on, because otherwise we'd have to go into a very long conversation on the principle. We'd become very conceptual. We get lost in it all. So one of the main principled framework, the first most important one of this framework is the quality of life in the classroom, and really looking at improving the quality of life in the classroom. And that's both for the teacher, obviously, but most importantly, for the students, right? And we'll go into a deeper conversation of what that means and my interpretation of that and what I looked at from that perspective. The other one is, the other principal point is something called potentially exploitable pedagogic activities. It's quite a mouthful.
I was just going to say, that's a heck of a term.
It is. Short, they're called PEPPERS. That's the acronym.
Oh, nice. Even better.
I know, academics speak in acronyms. So these PEPPERS were essential to the framework, because what they do is they marry both research, so that research happens at the same time as learning happens in the classroom. So very often what happens is research and teaching are seen as very 2 separate entities, right? So you're either a researcher or a teacher, right? Now, exploratory practice is a spin-off of action research, something that was developed in the 90s in Rio de Janeiro, and has had a ripple effect all over the world, thank God. But the main difference between exploratory practice and action research have been these potentially exploitable pedagogic activities. So the idea here is that because of this dichotomy, it almost always seemed that you could either be one or the other. And this was quite misleading, quite harmful, because teachers also believed that if I'm a teacher, can I also be a legitimate researcher? And I believe that I think you can't separate the two. In order to have good quality, classroom research, you need to be present there. You need to understand, who you're teaching, what you're teaching. Of course, the research is not quantitative, it's qualitative. Okay, so this involves a lot of conversations and really understanding who you're working with. It definitely requires a level of trust and understanding and authenticity and removing the egos. So this, and having some very sometimes difficult conversations, but they're honest. But I think that can only be achieved if you've already got, this classroom, environment and context that you're working in. I don't think this is something, I don't think you can get meaningful research if you've just come in, or if it's just a quantitative activity. So I think here, this type of research marries the two. So you can be a teacher, but you can be a researcher too. So you can be a research practitioner. And I think that's the main sort of, idea behind exploratory practice. So it's merging the two, it's building the bridge, if you like, between the two. And with the potentially exploitable pedagogic activities, what happens is that the learning takes place at the same time as the research. So you're not taking away valuable learning time from the students to do your research, but it's actually happening behind the scenes. And I can tell you that if you're somebody who loves to develop materials, content, great classroom content, then this is for you. You would absolutely love this, because you're not only developing meaningful content, that's a great learning experience for the students, but also you're getting very valuable research and feedback from that. So,
well, give me an example of, did you have a specific research question that you started with, and then, or a hypothesis or something that then you brought into the classroom, and then also, like, what is the role of the learner? Do they know they're participating in this, or so kind of, what are those?
Excellent questions. Yeah, absolutely. So the students absolutely know that they're taking part in this. It's ethics. You need to let them know.
Of course. I mean, obviously, but
there's no Jedi mind tricks here.
I guess for me, I was wondering, it riffing off the action research piece, right? Like, obviously there's consent, and, you're bringing your subjects in when you're interviewing them and whatnot, but, are you developing your hypothesis with the learners, and sort of this becomes a living sort of being, or is this sort of saying, hey, look, you're in this, when you give them the syllabus, hey, here's the research question we're also going to be doing while you're learning this? Like, how does it work?
No, I think you actually really phrased it very well. It just becomes its own living being, as you said. I think you phrased it really well. Exactly this. So obviously, the idea is really with exploratory practice is, the most important thing is that you're not looking potentially for solutions to problems. So what we say is that we're exploring puzzles, okay? So these puzzles can be both teaching puzzles and learning puzzles. So usually the puzzle is precipitated with the question of why. And the thing around exploratory practice is you have to approach it in a way that you're not necessarily, you may find an answer as to why certain things work in your classroom or don't work, right, as a teacher. But you can also, as a learner, ask yourself, why is it that I am, for example, an advanced speaker of English, but I still omit my articles? Right. Why is this something that I can't, or why is it that I still confuse my phrasal verbs after so many years of learning English? Or, there's so many, and the teacher, one of my puzzles was actually a positive puzzle, because they can be positive. It's not always trying to look at why something isn't working. So as I mentioned earlier, my module, I mean, it was working well. It was working really well because, and it was already, funnily enough, when I reflect back on this, I think I took to exploratory practice so well because I think naturally I really aligned with it. And even, the way my module had been set up had really aligned to this because I was very much into student-generated materials. And I saw this as I could just see my students transform with this. And obviously exploratory practice really tapped into this because not only were both my student and I content creators in the classroom, of course, it wasn't that I just let them just create content. Obviously, there was a lot of work in the background. It wasn't just me sitting back and my students teaching me. Of course, there's a lot of work in the background, as you can imagine, making sure it aligns with the competency framework, that the content is good. But, so what we were having was we were mutually developing classroom content that was later used in their final assessment. We had the modules split over 2 days in the week. So there was a clear distinction of a day where I would put input in, but then there was one day where the students would provide input. And then on top of all of that, we were doing exploratory practice. So it wasn't just me researching them and putting them under a microscope, but they were also becoming active researchers in the practice. So
does every student get that, like, create their own problem that they're researching?
Yeah.
Like, so I'm just like, I'm thinking about how do you even track this, right? Or does everybody kind of, is everyone in the classroom aware of and feel confident of sort of the research process and framework so that it goes from one researcher with many subjects to it's a many to many relationship, right? And that sounds like a lot to manage. Like, am I describing the complexity correctly? Or
yeah, you're right. It was very complex. There was a lot going on many different levels. But what surprised me was the maturity of my students and their ability to self-reflect and how they engaged in this. And to be quite honest with you, I think they caught on to exploratory practice quicker than I did, actually. I think back, it took me a long time.
They were young and open to it. Come on, they're these young minds, like.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, but later, obviously, yes, of course, there was an introduction as to what this was and why we were doing it. I didn't go very, very deep into it because really the idea was that with exploratory practice, it's sort of as you're doing it, you get it, sort of thing. So there wasn't that much sort of, oh, here's what it is. It was more an example of what I had done as a teacher and what I'm encouraging them to do as students when they're looking at their own puzzles, and pointing out that they might not necessarily find an answer to what they're looking for, but they need to be okay with that. So it's more about the journey rather than the destination. So I'd always think Wizard of Oz, okay? Like, yeah, everyone's going down the yellow brick road, and you might get there and discover that there isn't an answer there. There isn't a Wizard of Oz. It's just some old guy behind a curtain, right?
Right. Yeah.
And you have to be okay with that because you may come to the conclusion, well, the reason I omit articles is because, I don't know, most people, even at the most advanced levels, omit articles because naturally in my first language, there aren't any articles.
Right.
So it's just so, so you have to be okay with that. Of course, I'm somewhat simplifying, the example here, but I hope you understand here what I mean. So really it was a combination of, I think, yes, of course, you're absolutely right here. I was like, are my students going to be able to raise themselves to this challenge? Will they be able to rise to the challenge? And luckily, I was doing this project alongside, so we were guided by two, let's say our gurus in the area of exploratory practice. So one would come in from a different university, but we had one lady with us, Asia Rolls, Dr. Asia Rolls, amazing. Look her up if you are interested in exploratory practice. And she was guiding us, so that was very helpful. And we were a group, so we were doing a 2-year research project that was funded. by the university, and we were a group. So and we were all in the same boat. So we were all new to this. So the project was, this wasn't just me solely going and, I'm going to do some exploratory practice and see what happens. So this was very guided. Not to say that you can't do this on your own, but I think, definitely, liaising, talking, setting up exploratory practice groups really helps, because, you need that feedback loop. You need to have those discussions. And we were very lucky. We had that guidance from Dr. Asya Rolls, which was essential for us. So I think, at that point, I felt that really exploratory practice was tapping into what I felt I had lost. And
so I mean, but I was just going to say, it sounds like this is definitely an anecdote to a mechanical, the mechanics of, what am I trying to say there? Like the staleness of, sort of the same thing year after year, because quite literally you're feeding a petri dish of, like I said, all of these learners. Let's even just say you have a class of, 15 people or 10 learners, with 11, with 11 researchers, that's, so many nodes going in so many different directions, just facilitating that, and managing that's going to bring a whole lot of energy and life into your teaching practice, just in itself, just the management of this.
Yeah. So, absolutely this. I think the very obvious shift here for me was when all of this was taking place in my classroom, I did see this very clear shift that I was no longer looking at my students like just these bodies that I needed to fill with knowledge. And I think there was a big change in the way they saw me. And I've called this shift before, from authority to authenticity. So almost we got to a point then where I was not just seen as the sole subject expert or just the only person with the knowledge, but I was there, but they were too. And they proved to themselves that they did rise to the challenge, and they rose to the challenge very well, not only with the student-generated content, but also that was also, I think, definitely also further, further progressed with the research that was taking place in the classroom, because this was, week to week, very honest conversations. So I think that the shift that took place here was profound, because the shift that in the end took place was that both my students and I moved away from the performance zone into a true learning zone, both for me as a teacher, and for my students as well. So, and I think this is a tricky one, because it's difficult. It's difficult not to be bogged down by the dogma of it all. Of teachers are manipulated by professional standards and performance. Where we have to adhere to matrices and feedback and standards of institutions and students as well. Students also, sometimes they're not, a lot of the times they may not be learning for the sake of learning because they genuinely want to learn. They might also be very much in performance zone because they need to pass, because they have to do this degree, so we were both able to, sort of shift away from that. And I really feel that exploratory practice helped us a lot with that. At least we were questioning why we were doing what we were doing in the classroom. So I was questioning my puzzle, why things were working and why they weren't working in the classroom. And my students were doing this with their language. And most certainly the feedback that I got, of course, I have to, admit, not every student was on board with this. You can't win them all, which I think is, that's normal. And I was anticipating that not everyone was going to be engaged with that, but the vast majority were. And, I could just see a difference it wasn't just the difference in what was happening in the four walls of the classroom, but also on our learning, on our virtual learning environment, students were still engaging outside of our module. They were engaging more. They weren't just doing tasks for the sake of it, but we had a ongoing sort of chat that was happening, and they were discussing, all sorts of times, their puzzles and the content. So this is where I really saw a shift, but with both and I was getting engaged. I was coming into my modules with a different attitude, with just a different mindset. I was no longer going, oh, I'm just going to teach them, go to, I already know what the type of questions they're going to ask, because everything was thrown up and, turned on its head a bit. And the amount of very honest stations that we had, and the feedback that we had, and the space for self-reflection, not only for me to reflect on my own teaching, practice, but my students to reflect on their learning, was just, I felt that exploratory practice not only paved the way for it, but made the space for it. It really created this zone, safe zone, learning zone, authentic zone, whatever you want to call it. Something happened, and it was exploratory practice for sure that made this happen, this shift. I mean, even me, like, just when I talk about it, I smile, because it was just such an amazing period of my life in teaching. I really felt like, I was in the zone,
Nice. Marianna Goral, thank you so much for being a guest on the eLearning podcast today. I feel like this is a conversation that we need to continue, and I look forward to circling back with you, here in the next 6 months or maybe a year from now, to see how it continues to grow and develop, and learn more about exploratory practice and how we can all bring it into, our teaching to make it more alive. Thank you so much.
Oh, absolutely. And thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks again for tuning into today's episode of the eLearning podcast. If you like what you heard, please do me the favor of following us on LinkedIn, Twitter, or whichever social media you prefer. Also, if you're interested in diving deeper on eLearning, I encourage you to get your free ticket to the eLearning Success Summit, where there are more than 70 hours of presentations on best practices. Just go to elearningsuccesssummit.com. And then finally, for the latest news, information, and resources about eLearning, come subscribe to our newsletter at lmspulse.com. Thanks.